It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Yunxiang Gao, who is Associate Professor of History at Ryerson University in Toronto. She and I actually became acquainted through the Chinese dance collection here at the University of Michigan. She was one of the first scholars to reach out and ask for permission to use one of our historical photographs in the Pioneers of Chinese Dance archive. And then I found out that Professor Gao is writing a chapter of her new book on a very important dancer, Sylvia Chen, about whom I'm also writing a chapter in my book. And so I was instantly excited to learn more about her research. And that's what led to the invitation to have her come speak today. Her research deals with a topic that's getting a lot of attention now in Asian studies, and specifically that's the issue of Transpacific cultural history. And she's looking at that during the topic of World War II. Her first book, Sporting Gender, Women Athletes and Celebrity Making During China's National Crisis, 1931 to 1945, appeared in 2013 with the University of British Columbia Press. She has also published articles in the Du Bois Review, Gender and History, the Journal of American East Asian Relations, Modern Chinese Literature and Culture, and Sport and Society. Several of her articles have been translated into Chinese. Currently, Professor Gao is finishing two books. One is entitled Arise, Africa, Roar, China, Sino-African American Citizens of the World in the 20th Century. And I believe there's a chapter from that we're hearing today. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah.
Excellent. And this book focuses on the cultural network of Chinese and African Americans, including W.E.B Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Langston Hughes, actress Wang Ying, founder of mass singing Liu Liangmo, and modern dancer Sylvia Xilan Chen. The other book that she's working on is a biography tentatively entitled I forget what you told me. Su Yang, yeah. A Hollywood actress and cosmopolitan of the Asian diasporas. So let's welcome Professor Gao.
Thank you, Dr. Wilcox, for the very nice introduction. Can everybody hear me?
I think you have to speak into the microphone, right? Or does she have one? Oh, you have one.
Oh, I have one. Okay, so. And also, thanks everybody for being here despite the snow and the cold weather. Okay, and also I would like to say thanks. I would like to thank Ina for arranging my visit. Okay, now let's get started. And as the Professor Wilcox mentioned, today's talk excerpts one chapter from my book manuscript, and here, as you can see, and the title, and also as you can see. The book covers 6 outstanding figures right here, including our hero today, Liu Liangmo. Okay, so I would like to start my story on Liu Liangmo with a song here. Let's see, hope it's still here. I tried before.
Song born in the struggle of the brave Chinese. This is a song born in the struggle of the brave Chinese people. It begins Qi Lai. Arise, you who refuse to be bond slaves. And ends Chen Jing. March on.
Okay.
Qi Lai，不就按所努力的人们，把我们的血肉组成我们新的长城。中华民族到了最危险的时候，每个人被迫就发出最好的号声，起来，起来，起来！我们万众一心，冒着地上的炮火前进，冒着地上的炮火前进。Arise, you who refuse to be bond slaves. Let's stand up and fight for liberty.
Okay, let's stop here. You got the idea, right? As we all know what that is about, that was the national anthem of China today, right? Okay, but the question is, who was this guy singing this song? And so for the youngsters here, you may not know, and his name was Paul Robeson. Okay, so who was Robeson? He was a world-famous actor and a singer. And he was also a accomplished athlete and a linguist and also lawyer. Okay, And the question for us here was how Robeson was connected with this song. Okay, and who arranged this album we see here? Okay, so that was where Liu Liangmo's story kicked in. Okay, who was Liu Liangmo then? Okay, and the Time magazine lauded him as a man who largely coaxed the Chinese into mass singing and for national unity against the Japanese invasion and also to uplift the wartime morale. Okay, so Liu Liangmo was a graduate of the missionary Shanghai University of Shanghai. So from 1930 to 1949, he held the positions of the student secretary of the Chinese National YMCA. Okay, so within that capacity, he launched the so-called mass singing movement. And by organizing the People's Choral Society, basically those people, the people in those society were office boys, cleaning ladies, and in the neighborhood. Okay, he taught them to sing the new genre called songs of resistance or the folk songs. So this new category was invented for wartime mobilization. Okay, so very quickly he expanded this movement into military use. Okay, as you can see from the slide on the top, he traveled to Inner Mongolia to teach. Many religions. One example was it became legendary. He taught about 10,000 soldiers one song in 40 minutes. Okay, and in the in the sandstorm of Inner Mongolia. Okay, and so his technique basically was teaching about 40 soldiers the lyrics first, then place them around in the ranks. Okay, and so after the full-scale war broke out, Liu Liangmo and his followers traveled across the front lines for 18 months. What they did was to organize mass singing chorus and help the wounded soldiers and promote unities between the civilians and the military. And for the resistance, okay, and as you can see here, when he was in Changsha, this is one of the pictures, okay, and so let's see here, in this effort, in the wartime effort where he traveled across in the front, he came across Agnes Smedley, okay, the radical American journalist. So here, Smedley testified Liu Liangmo's moral uplifting, fundraising, and skill in organization, as we can see here. Okay, so after the Nanjing massacre happened, Liu Liangmo particularly called on China to utilize the inspiring power of mass singing to transform the pigs and lambs slaughtered mercilessly by the Japanese into iron soldiers. Okay, so that was what he was trying to do. And meanwhile, he used his prolific journalism and his talent in photography to promote all these goals. As you can see, he was multiple talented. Okay, and however, despite his heroism and devotion in the front line, he was detained by the nationalist government for 2 months. Okay, and because he traveled to the guerrilla area dominated by the Communist New Force Army. Okay, so after he was released, and he escaped to the United States, and as a student to study in Cruiser Seminary, okay, in Philadelphia. Okay, so remember that during the period of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that was a common way for Chinese to travel to U.S. Okay, be a student. Okay, and so once he traveled there, another important Chinese American, Lin Yutang, probably a lot of you know about him. Okay, wrote a laudatory article about Liu Liangmo in Asia magazine. Later on, very quickly, this piece was picked up by Reader's Digest, with wide circulation, and also the Time magazine. You could see such high-profile publicity of Liu Liangmo led to breakout performance in national radio. Okay, and here I'm going to give you a little bit a taste of his performance on radio. Okay, Let's see and listen to this a little bit.
China shall have our help. These are the words which this week launched a nationwide drive by the affiliated organizations of United China Relief to raise $5 million for the Republic of China. United China Relief is a union of all major organizations which previously have worked independently in enlisting the aid and sympathy of the American people in the plight of the people of China. And the pledge these organizations have made echoes the thought in the minds of every American. China shall have our help. Marking Chinese Cultural Day, WOR Special Features Division,
Okay, let's
in cooperation
fast
with the
forward a
United
little
China
bit
Relief,
to listen to Liu Liangmo to sing a little bit. Okay,
Snow behind the enemy lines.
that's Liu Liangmo's
This
voice.
song
I'm going to move
illustrates the spirit
to
of the
9.
For hearing that song, the
Minutes?
ancient here.
Okay.
And now, Mr. Liu, I believe you have another modern song for us.
Yes, Dr. Spade, it is very modern. The name of it is Go to the Rear of the Enemy and Give Them a Kick in the Pants.
Go to the rear of the enemy. Well, let's hear it.
It is
So
a
let's
song
finish
of
this
the
song.
Chinese guerrilla armies, which operate for months at a time behind the enemy lines. This song illustrates the spirit of their life. The words go something like this. In snow or rain, from north and south, you will find the guerrilla armies who go to the rear of the enemy and give them a kick in the pants. 到敌人后方去把规则赶出进，到敌人后方去把规则赶出进，不怕雨不怕风，保和路出奇兵，今天攻下了一个村，
Okay,
明
you
天
got a
夺
little
回了
idea. Okay, so here, as you can see, this describes what I put down a few sentences from this radio performance. As you could see, this program was co-sponsored by the United China Relief. Okay, as we all know, or it may not know, but anyway, United China Relief was the single biggest contributor to aid wartime China. Okay, so here Liu Liangmo's one of the breakout performances, you could say, was very successful, marked by his easy switch back between Mandarin and English. Okay, and a clear diction and easy presentation. So therefore, so impressed, the United China Relief leadership offered him a job as an entertainer and singer to tour across the U.S. As based in New York City. Okay, and so that prestigious platform very quickly transformed Liu Liangmo into basically an unknown immigrant, into somewhat household name, and after the Pearl Harbor especially. Okay, and so here I'm going to talk about what Liu Liangmo did in the U.S. And first, I would like to remind you the context he was working in. So remember, I mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act and also Jim Crow, basically segregation. Okay, and also you have to note he was under close surveillance by the FBI, and also by the immigration, and also by War and State Departments. So therefore, he had to proceed with caution, with courage, and with charm. Okay, he possessed that all. Okay, and so about race, at that point, listeners and audiences of Liu Liangmo, occasionally they would cross the color line, but it was normative for racial segregation. Therefore, this context defined his approach to tell the story about China, to urge American assistance for China. Okay, and that is to say, race-based. Okay, so his initial outreach was toward African Americans. Okay, and so that bridges the gap between leftist Chinese and African American nationalism. Okay, and Liu Liangmo's initial, outreach toward African Americans was marked by his collegiality with black leaders, including Paul Robeson. Okay, and I go back to the story a little bit, and Liu Liangmo knew about Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson had been known in China. Okay, and also Liu Liangmo heard the story about Paul Robeson's travels to Spain to sing songs for the defendant of the Spanish Republic. Okay, And also he heard Paul Robeson frequently sing songs of different nations, in their native language. So therefore, before he came to U.S., he brought some songs of Chinese resistance and folk songs, and he was hoping Paul Robeson would perform. Okay, so in February 1941, about half years after he arrived in U.S., he visited Liu Liangmo in New York City. Okay, then he mentioned his wish to meet Paul Robeson, and then Liu Liangmo happened to know Paul Robeson and called up immediately. And as Liu Liangmo recalled, within a half hour, the singer was in Liu Liangmo's apartment, beaming over me with a big smile, and his giant hands were holding mine firmly. Okay, so they became immediate friends. Okay, and then Robeson asked about the mass singing movement Liu Liangmo was doing in China. Of course, he introduced all about this new type, etc., performed some for Paul Robeson. Robeson liked one particularly, and that is to say, Qilai. Okay, and why? He said, because arise, you who refuse to be bound slaves, express the determination for all oppressed people, including Chinese and blacks, for their struggle for liberation. Okay, and so Liu Liangmo recorded. Robeson listened. When he performed this song, Robeson listened closely and took some notes and took a copy away. So a few weeks later, Liu Liangmo attended an open door concert by Robeson under bright stars. Okay, so Robeson performed some songs at a fest, right? And then he announced, "Now I'm going to sing a song to honor the great Chinese people. This song is called Qilai." Okay, so that is to say. So the cooperation between Liu Liangmo and Robeson began to bring this song, into popularity among American audiences. Okay. Then next year, arranged by the United China Relief, Liu Liangmo and Robeson, and also a new organization called Chinese People's Chorus. And so which organization was this? Liu Liangmo had organized among the Chinese Head Laundry Alliance, okay, in Chinatown of New York City. Okay, so they recorded this album. Okay, and at the very beginning, we listened to this song a little bit from that album. Okay, and so Madam Ryerson wrote insert notes for this album, and let me read a little bit for you. Let's see. Yeah, he said, praised Robeson as the voice of the people of all lands. And for Liu Liangmo, he said, our old Liu Liangmo, who has taught a nation of soldiers, guerrillas, farmers, and road builders to sing while they toil and fight. And he hoped that album would be another bond between free people. Okay, and so New York Times noted this album was the best of that year. Okay, and also he, of course, the New York Times noted the fund raised by this album contribute to China Relief. Even a newspaper in China, and Da Gongbao, probably some of you know about this newspaper, now in exile in Guilin, heard about this album and talked about how popular it was across America. Okay, and that is to say, so far I have talked about how. And through the cooperation between Liu Liangmo and Paul Robeson. And by the way, I forgot to mention, Paul Robeson reprised this song in many of his concerts in America, in Europe. Okay, and through their cooperation, this song became world famous. Okay, and meanwhile, as you could see, Liu Liangmo and Paul Robeson appeared together on other occasions beyond Qilai, right? Okay, at the top was a camp. Probably, some people know about this camp in New Jersey. It was an interracial leftist camp, and both their sons attended this camp. And Liu Liangmo taught songs, as you can see at the top, you can say from top slide, to the campers and also to the counselors, and including Qilai. Actually, he led an American youth chorus to compete in New York City, including Qilai. Okay, and as you can see from this slide, they appeared on many gatherings together and to raise funds for China and for this occasion, and also to cheer African Americans' war efforts. Okay, and so far was about cooperation with Robeson. And Liu Liangmo had another major achievement in connecting with African American. That is to say, she wrote about, as I put here, 123 pieces of a weekly column for this newspaper called Pittsburgh Courier. Okay, so that was the biggest African American newspaper. Okay, and so Liu Liangmo later on proudly recalled in Guangming Daily. He said, that was the first time a Chinese was invited by a major black newspaper to contribute a column. Okay, and so basically what he was trying to communicate with the black readership with his column. Here I noted a few points he was trying to make. So first he noted, and so African Americans actually contribute a major part of the United China Relief Fund. Okay, and he actually shared this sentiment with his Chinese readers back home. In a published letter, he talked about how during his lecture tour, one black maid from the restaurant emerged from the kitchen, tried to donate $50, and as a whole, that would be a lot of money for her because she overheard the plight of China, and when Liu was talking with his friend in the restaurant. Okay, that's the first point. And also, Liu talked about the major issues faced African Americans and Chinese Americans, and the Jim Crow laws, and Chinese Exclusion Act, and the poll tax, and also the lynching against African Americans. So he felt this all connected together. He advocated, they should be all abolished. Okay, he called on African Americans to support the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay, when it finally happened in late 1943, and he declared that was a major step for equality, and it was time to abolish the poll tax because that stopped a lot of African Americans from voting in American South. Okay. And another thing he did was to connect the oppression suffered by African and Chinese Americans with the American neglect of the Chinese war efforts. He said, we cannot receive equal treatment even now. How could we expect that after the war? Okay, and then some people ask him, why do you care about African American issues so vehemently? And here his argument was, and any progressive Chinese like me should do the same. Okay, he argued because, as you see here, the Chinese American here, are mostly ignorant about the mistreatment of Negroes suffered. I believe it's my duty to teach them and to let them learn. Okay, and so he may be arguing this, but not everybody approved. Okay, as I mentioned, the FBI was following his activities with Robeson closely already. Okay, and here his racial angle intensified the agency's scrutiny on him. Okay, as I put here, the naval commander commented about Liu Liangmo and mentioned he was a newspaper columnist and contributing to the Negro press, emphasized he was a very racial conscious. That was a problem. Okay, and also later on, I should stop here. That was a story here, and so therefore, under this context, it was reasonable. Liu Liangmo was very careful about dealing with the Chinese American community. Okay, because it was more contentious, closely mirrored the political complexities in China. Okay, so here, come back to the Chinese Exclusion Act a little bit. You have to understand who were in the Chinese American community then. So you had the educated, respected elite, and they were associated with the nationalist government somewhat. And then you have the bachelor society, basically, in Chinatown, laundry workers and excuse me, restaurant workers. Okay. Basically, the workers turned left, right, and be that was why we talked about Liu Liangmo basically were working with the workers. And he kept a distance from the elite and Chinese community. Okay, why he was so worried? He had a reason, as you could see, as a naval commander, and suspected he was a sponsor of the leftist China Defense Corps in New York City. And J. Edgar Hoover, the notorious director of the FBI, informed, you should keep an eye, the field officers keep an eye on Liu Liangmo, about his possible influence on the Chinese community because his communist sympathies and connections. Okay, so therefore, Liu Liangmo probably was all aware of this. He kept distance from the elite members, as I said, and despite that, and the FBI informants. Who were the FBI informants? And the leader, the director of China Institute, still exists in New York City today, and also the director of the Ministry of Information, and based in Rockefeller Center. And they reported him to the FBI, sometimes with exaggerations. Okay, and despite that, he managed to teach the workers to sing patriotic songs, as you can see here. Okay, beyond use the Chinese people's chorus to record an album, he came to Chinatown, to practice songs with the chorus every Saturday. Okay, and also they performed in the Union Square in New York City in the 40s. Okay, and so his influence in New York City, Chinatown, among the laundry workers, the restaurant workers, and we could discern that from fiction by Lin Yutang about Chinatown family. Okay, so in the plot here in this story, talk about how the main character came to Chinatown and saw a big fort and thousands of people gathering underneath the national flag, singing "Qilai." Okay. And later on, an American singer, based on the image of Robeson, repeated the song. And Lin Yutang commented, this was something totally new in Chinatown, never happened before. Okay, so, sorry. So far we talked about his work with African Americans, with Chinese Americans, right? And so if his efforts, his work with Chinese Americans were not that visible nationally, his collaboration, his work with white middle-class Americans were most celebrated, most visible. Okay, so as the United China Relief celebrated, Liu Liangmo traveled about 100,000 miles across U.S., almost every state, to tell the thrilling story about China's resistance, fight against the Japanese. Okay, so I traced all the local newspapers and uncovered about 300 articles essays about his tour. Okay, so confirmed they were not exaggerating. He was almost in every state, sometimes more than once, and I'm sure it was about more than 100,000 miles. Okay, and as you could imagine, such a wide coverage in local newspaper reinforced his fame among grassroots Americans, right, white Americans. And basically, sometimes he shared stages with famous American politicians, including President Roosevelt, Vice President, and State Secretary, and also New York Mayor, you name a few, LaGuardia, and the airport is named after him, right? And also the Nobel laureate, Pearl Bark, and among all the others. But most frequently, he was talking to churches, and schools, and women's clubs, Rotary clubs, and small audiences. Travel in a very through a very intensive schedule to talk with them, to give speeches, to sing songs, and also comment sometimes war propaganda films from China. Okay, and sometimes he conducted a radio performance in every state to reach broader audiences. And also he appeared in the New York Times radio station to give concert, emphasize how the traditional Chinese music was willing and weak, and now strong and militant right now. Okay, so some of these clips and recordings, on radio, also his individual recordings are preserved in the Library of Congress. Okay, you can find all of that. Okay, so, and to put a long story short, is that we can see And because of his Christian background, and he was able to establish a close connection, I would put, with American soul. Okay, and nobody else, no other Chinese, matched his broad and deep experience with, with the leading American politicians or other elites, and also average private citizens. Excuse me. And across broad spectrum, and across gender, across class, across race, and through speeches, and through fests of songs, and relaxation over dinners, and sometimes worshiping together. Okay, and as you can see from this, this appears frequently from the local newspaper. He had a good connection with his women audiences, right? Okay, he was comfortable among them. And also here you could see the publicity from the United China Relief. On the right side, here on the left side, they frame his story, who was he, right? And the right side, they selected as a testament of his popularity among local leaders. Okay. However, popularity couldn't completely protect or shield him from controversies, ideological and political controversies across the Pacific. Okay, so every speech, every comment he made about the situation in China was watched closely. Sometimes cross-reference to his comments in Pittsburgh Courier, critical of the Chinese nationalist government, could lead to tricky political consequences for him. For example, once student journalist in Rutgers University reported he was making disparaging comments about Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government. Okay, and so very quickly, some local newspapers, the New York Post and even New York Times, and pick up the story. So made it a big deal. So that incident created an embarrassing situation for the United China Relief, and also potentially dangerous for himself. Okay, and around the same time, the surveillance of the FBI finally emerged on the surface. And between 1944 and 1945, the agents visited the office of the director of the United China Relief 3 times to verify his communist connections. And of course, the United China Relief would contact him in the middle of his speech. He was in the Washington hotel. Oh, he was communist. And the FBI contacted us. And he was heard at Access and immediately wrote a letter from the hotel to clarify his position. But eventually, ultimately, the threat of deportation and also the invitation from Zhou Enlai, from the People's Republic of China, and the Zhou Enlai's invitation for him to attend the first People's Political Consultative Conference at the grand opening of the PRC enabled him to slip back to China. Okay, so after he returned to China, and to put a long story short, he served, and his major post was the chief staff of the National Y for over 4 decades. That was his position, mainly. So that enabled him to function as the 4th leading figure in the official religious circle. And meanwhile, he remained active among different so-called democratic parties and also the political consultative conferences in Shanghai and also around national level. Meanwhile, journalism remained a key to his fame and visibility, and also a sign for his influence and power still. Okay, and so if you look through the major official newspapers like People's Daily, Guangming Daily, and the Liberation Daily, and also a high-profile Christian magazine called Heavenly Wind, you could see about hundreds of articles, speeches by him and about him. Okay, so what he basically did during the PRC era, okay, I would say 3 things. First, he devoted most of his energy to the so-called 3 Self movement. So what was the 3 Self movement? It was an official campaign and to make Chinese churches to cut their ties with missionary efforts, to bring the church's Christianity under official ideology. He played a major role in that effort. As you can see, he employed an old tool into contemporary goal. He composed a song called Song for Three Self-Reform Movement, and the lyric reads something like this: "Arise, Christians across China, churches in China, hurry, study hard." Study what hard? Study the official ideology, right? Okay, that's one thing. Another thing was, so I have very little time left, right? Okay, so when, involvement in the Civil War and the Korean War transformed the narrative about the U.S. from China's ally to the top enemy. Okay, Liu Liangmo became the credible commentator to reframe that narrative. Okay, so remember we talked about nobody could match his experience with Americans, right? Okay, so what he had to say about Americans must be true. Okay, so he published a lot, and right at this point, his big efforts with white and middle class Americans ideologically became worthless, right? But his contribution was to foreground the image of African Americans. Okay, and how? Foregrounded their revolutionary credentials and their intellectual capacities over what? Over the mainstream image before 1949. What kind of image they had? And primitive athletes, and music persona, not respectable, and also commercialized exotism. Okay, so actually, based on my own research, Liu Liangmo was the first person who held the black greatness among Chinese without a reservation. Okay, and he believed in the Chinese stereotypes viewing African Americans as racially inferior was because of the evil propaganda of the American imperialists ruling class. Okay, and so therefore he was the first Chinese introduced those two African Americans, Frederick Douglass, and also the scientist George Washington Carver, arranged the translation of their biographies. Of course, and his major praise focused on Paul Robeson, his old friend. Okay, and so he wrote a major piece circulated widely about Robeson even before the establishment of People's Republic of China, and redefined Robeson as exotic entertainer, and to the role model for all Chinese citizens. Okay, so that was what he did. Okay, and so lastly, I would like to talk about his situation in the People's Republic of China. Now, as everybody could imagine, his credential, his experience would make him a perfect target and to be attacked as what? American spy. So remember, a lot of innocent people were attacked as American spy, and their life and careers were ruined. So what about him? So it was a miracle. He rode, on the waves of political tornadoes, and basically intact. Okay, that was incredible, right? And so his basic technique was to defend all the radical political movements rigorously, and also help to purge those under attack ruthlessly. So that kind of, in my opinion, tarnished his legacy a little bit. Okay, and so I think time to conclude, right? So my conclusion here, what is the significance about his story and navigating the murky ideological and political water, across the Pacific, and I would say with political agility, slipping back and forth, basically unharmed throughout the most of the 20th century. Okay, and so for his personal legacy, you could see his technique to use mass singing for war mobilization was transformed into a powerful propaganda tool for the People's Liberation Army, and also the radical political campaigns in a new format called Red Songs. Okay, and also we all know about the alliance between the Maoist China and radical African American movements, right? Okay, so that alliance could be traced back to Liu Liangmo's efforts. Okay, so ultimately his story, I think, helped to redefine the current scholarship on Sino-American relations. How? Because all the scholarship on Sino-American relations basically treat American as defaultly white. So his story would add and foreground the story of African Americans in this dynamic. Okay, and meanwhile, another thing his story did, was to connect Black internationalism with the story of Chinese Americans across Pacific. Okay, and also his story helped us to understand the making of modern Chinese popular culture, including qilai. Okay, and to understand the making of this in war, in Cold War, or in the Second World War through global circulation. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you.
Questions for Professor Gao?
Thank you very much for this very informative talk about a man I had not heard of before. Sounds like a really great person.
What do you mean, Liu Liangmo?
Yes.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Does his involvement with the Black American culture, I know that the Black Panthers went to China in 1971, before Nixon went there, and Huey P. Long and Elaine Brown and Robert Bay. Was he involved in any way with that?
Yes, that's a very good question. Actually, he was a major cultural figure, continued to facilitate the connection between the Maoist China and African Americans. For example, he arranged the translation of Graham Du Bois' biography of Robeson, and he helped to arrange Graham and W.E.B. Du Bois visit in 1959. And also, he was on the scene where all the Black Panthers and all other radical African Americans were in China. And so he continued to serve as a facilitator. Okay.
And you had a slide showing the accolades, the people who had attended his speeches. Are there transcripts, written transcripts of his speeches from the time 1941 through 48?
You mean the back here?
Yes.
The radio?
No, the slide that first slide you showed there. No, further on in the presentation.
This one?
No, keep going.
Oh, this. No, I haven't seen the transcript about his.
It was a list of comments by people who had attended his speeches.
Oh, they testified. His. That's actually the publicity paper I found from the United China Relief Archives. And so people wrote letters back to the United China Relief and talk about how they want to invite him back, how good he was.
Are there transcripts of the speeches?
No, I haven't found transcripts.
You haven't been able to find that?
No. But the local newspapers would talk about it, summarize what he said, what he have quotes here and there.
And he did not leave written records of his speeches?
I'm not aware of. Yeah. Okay.
That would be very interesting to see today.
He has a great son. He was, you can see from here, it's something very interesting. This is the first son born in China during the war. This is the second son, actually planned. And because they were fighting, the family was fighting the immigration. And some people gave them an idea to maybe have a second son as an instant American citizen to help to keep them here, So anyway, they have a grad son in China teaching in the university in Shanghai. I contacted him, but he didn't get back to me. So maybe in the family, but the archives in the U.S., I didn't find the transcript.
One last little question. In addition to his singing ability, did he play a musical instrument?
Oh, that's a very good question. No, you know, his music, you know, is very simple. You know, he published a lot of musical books, pamphlets, and just very simplified notes, very simple lyrics, and simple notes everybody could read and learn very quickly. And I'm not aware he was playing any musical instrument. As you can see, he sang. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you
welcome.
very much.
Yeah.
I'm really curious about these 6 figures that you've selected for your book project.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that stands out about Liu Liangmo is that he brings together like cultural groups that we wouldn't expect. And specifically, I'm interested in him as a leftist, like revolutionary figure who's very closely connected to the YMCA and Christianity. And I'm curious, I guess, more to hear a bit more about that. Like, how common was it for people like him in China at the time to be very closely connected to the Christian groups, but then also to be leftist figures? Was that a common pathway, or was he unusual in that sense? And then I'm also, that's my first question. And my second question is whether part of your selection of these figures is people who explicitly cross what we would expect to be these kind of cultural barriers, in addition to the obvious connection of them being Chinese and African American connections.
Okay. You know, a very good question about the first one, how unique Liu Liangmo was, right? Yeah. Okay. I think he was pretty unique. I didn't find any other figures like him. Like Wang Ying, another figure. And Wang Ying was a communist, more real communist, and more leftist than Liu Liangmo, but he was not a Christian, right? And so, of course, he was not Christian if he was a communist. You know, it was common for Chinese sojourners came here and to establish connections with Americans during the war, but uncommon with African Americans. So he was a very he was a pioneer in that regard. Even Wang Ying worked with Robeson and Robeson's wife a little bit, but not as deep as Liu Liangmo was involved, let alone, the Christianity. Christianity aspect was pretty common. Again, it was uncommon to work with African Americans. Okay. And so your second question about selecting these figures, but basically I'm selecting, those 3 African Americans, and I'm trying to cover their connection with China or Chinese and talked about, right? We have all familiar figures. You talk about the Black Panthers, the radicals, but people are not aware, not talk about them. The cultural giants of African Americans in 20th century, they all had a deep connection with China and Chinese. That's the standard for them to select, for me to select them. And for Liu Liangmo was, basically, as you said, he kind of facilitated the connection. And Wang Ying was less, actually I'm thinking about whether I should cut Wang Ying out, as the reviewer actually suggesting. Okay, because her connection with African Americans only so not that deep. Okay, and for Silan Chen, probably and for everybody else, see herself, Robeson and she had a romantic relationship with Hughes, so both of them thought, and she symbolized the Sino-African, Sino-Black union because she was biracial. She was from Caribbean. But her mother was French Creole. Her father was China's first foreign minister under Sun Yat-sen after 1911. Okay, so Chinese, of course. So that's how I selected them. Okay. Yeah.
Hi. Could you tell us a little bit more about the tradition of mass singing before this? Was it basically nationalistic or religious? Or what was the tradition?
A very, very good question. Okay, so why we consider Liu Liangmo, was making a movement? How revolutionary was that? Okay, and so that has to trace back about the perception of singing, not let alone mass singing in China. Okay, and in traditional Chinese culture, and singing was not viewed as something respectable, right? And so singing was reserved to professional singers, and also street vendors. You shouting loudly, singing what you're selling, okay? And so we don't see mass singing. And also the elites, intellectuals, people like Liu Liangmo, They wouldn't pursue singing. They would be entertained, but they were not going to do that themselves. Okay, so here, Liu Liangmo transformed the role, the image of singing. It's respectable, it's political, okay? And also, he invented mass singing. That never happened before. And I think because he's a Christian background, okay? Because in church, mass singing is a method for mobilization or spiritual inspiration. And he adapted this into the war environment. Okay. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about how this maybe fits within some of the other scholarship we've seen recently on sort of Chinese interpreters of Chinese culture to the American public. And I'm thinking specifically of Hua Xu's recent book, The Floating Chinaman, and the ways in which certain Chinese writers, H.T. Xiang is sort of not successful compared to Lin Yutang during the same period. And it seems like Liu Liangmo is kind of in between the two of them. So I wondered if, on that question that Hua Xu asked of who gets to speak for China, right, how you can maybe position Liu Liangmo in between these other Chinese writers, artists, cultural producers who are also interpreting China to the American public, and how he's able to find kind of a relative space relative to some of these others who are also speaking for China.
That's a very good question, okay? And so basically that was a core dispute. Who had the authority to speak about China, about Chineseness, right? You have Huang Xu is a floating Chinaman, and you have Lin Yutang, you have Pearl Bark, and where did Liu Liangmo fit in? Okay, and so as I mentioned, he was supported first by Lin Yutang, right? Okay, so Pearl Bark and Lin Yutang were kind of a gatekeeper for speaking about China and Chineseness. Okay, and he gained support from Lin Yutang. That was how he, all the connections, the doors opened for him. Okay, and of course he was more successful than the floating Chinaman and Hua Xu covered. Okay, and but I think here he had he was supported by Lin Yutang, but also he had a backing of the leftist circle. And his I didn't mention in the lecture, but his trip was arranged by Madame Ryerson, and also arranged by Zhou Enlai. Okay, so they had that kind of backing. So therefore, he had a little bit of advantage. Also, Lin Yutang supported him, and later on, he and Lin Yutang had fight over the messages. And what kind of China are you presenting? Okay, and he had an article. And just attacked Lin Yutang was representing the old, stereotypical Chinese. And he also attacked Pearl Bark, and he called him the daughter of a white imperialist Americans or something, like presenting the stereotypical old China, and so that her wallet could be filled. Okay, and so now I'm the one, okay, presenting the real young fighting China. Okay, so I think to answer your question, it has all this contesting field, and who was representing the real China, okay? And so he was arguing for himself, and so I'm presenting the new, modern, useful China against Lin Yutang and Pearl Bark and the old schools, the traditional old way. And so this is the real deal today, okay? Hello?
Any other questions?
I found it interesting. You talked a little bit about your methodology, and you looked at a lot of local newspapers. I was curious if you noticed the way that the newspapers treated Liu Liangmo, depending on where they were in the United States, like comparing northern and southern newspapers, or like coastal and like central places. If you saw, were they basically reproducing the same interpretations of him?
That's a very good question as well. Okay, go back a little bit to this slide. Here, you can see I have read many of them. So this is only direct quote I put for you here. So this is from Baltimore Sun. So he's a little man, big voice, keep China thinking. Okay, and so basically I think the tone the same. Emphasize he was a Christian. That's very, very important. Okay, and also emphasize he was approved by Chiang Kai-shek, despite all the complex story behind it. And so there's two messages in every coverage. There's other things, praise his voice, praise his singing, etc. I don't see a lot of distinctions among the American newspapers. I think, before he took a place, I think the United China Relief supplied publicity materials. I feel, the local newspapers basically adapted from what provided. Okay, like, this piece, the left side. So it was repeated almost in every local newspaper coverage. That's how the United China Relief defined him, who he was, Christian, okay, and also very educated. And some newspaper even mistakenly called him Dr. Liu Liangmo. Okay, so emphasize his education, his academic credential, and also talk about, and he was directly underling or associated from Chiang Kai-shek. So that's three things I think basically from here. Yeah. But it's a very good question, and to look into all those.
Yeah. Do you know what particular sect of Christianity he belonged to, or
yes, I do. Baptist.
A Baptist.
So remember,
of the type similar to the Chinese unique version by Watchman Nee.
I don't know about that one. What is that about? You can tell.
Well, he was a pastor who split with the Anglican Church in terms of making the Christian religion more accessible to the Chinese and also more separated from the British versions that were common in the region where he lived.
Yeah,
there are many Christian groups here in the United States that follow his teachings.
Yeah, I didn't go into that kind of details. Good to know, although. And I just know he was Baptist. Remember, University of Shanghai, that was where he graduated. He converted to Christianity. His parents were Buddhists. And so converted to Christianity under the leadership of the president of the university. His name was Liu Liangmo. And actually, he arranged Du Bois' visit, kind of in Shanghai, facilitated a little bit. And so he was the first Chinese president of this missionary university, because after 1927, the wave of replacing missionaries with Chinese leadership. So he was a Baptist. So therefore, under his leadership and influence, Liu Liangmo became a Baptist.
So any other questions?
I'll yell it out. What happened to him in the latter part of his life? Did he get caught in the Cultural Revolution? Did he ever come back to the U.S. or whatever?
Okay, so he never suffered. Okay, so he was always on the top. That's why I said he was riding on the top of all the political waves. If you're familiar with land reform, and he beat the drum for that, and then anti-rightist movement, he started to attack, the Hufeng. People know about Hufeng anti-revolutionary group. He called Hufeng wolf under sheepskin. They attacked very violently. And then he offered self-criticism, so how he needs to transfer, reform himself. And also during the Great Leap Forward, and he beat the drum loud. He accomplished, he proved and testified all the accomplishments of a Great Leap Forward. For example, he visited a commune near Shanghai. He talked about how the irrigation system, the coal mining were much better than in the U.S. And also he emphasized, and people have electricity, and they eat well, they were all happy. Similar to Du Bois' description after he returned in 1959 in the middle of the Great Leap Forward famine. And people argue Du Bois might be naive, but Liu Liangmo was not naive. He knew people were, starving, but he made a point, emphasize in this commune people were eating good quality rice, and he and other visitors tasted was good. But the irony was he published an article in People's Daily, and what does the article say? Basically, he advised people how to wash your rice before you cook, so you can save food. And so how to wash, just put in the basket and rub very gently. And don't rub too hard because that will waste food. Okay, that it indicated he knew the famine and shortage of food was ongoing. And so one thing he did in the Cultural Revolution, to tell you your question about the Cultural Revolution. And based on my research, I think we all know about the concept of Mao Zedong thought, right? So everybody imagined that was an idea created during the Cultural Revolution. But Liu Liangmo, in 1950, he published 4 kind of manuals in book format. The manuals were basically how to study the modern concept, and including how to study Mao Zedong thought. I didn't know, and before Cultural Revolution, even earlier, they had this concept. He came up with this concept. And so in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, in the peak of the Cultural Revolution, his piece was reissued, republished. So you could imagine his standards. Okay, so after the Cultural Revolution, and some of his friends from the US actually visited him in Shanghai, and the newspaper reported how they sang Qilai together, and also American newspaper covered this event, and so indicated this is a sign the cultural. I mean, that's 1980, to show to show China was opening up again, because see, this Liu Liangmo person was very important coverage in the major newspaper. So later on, despite his article was about Mao Zedong thought was released, it said he never suffered, but very subtly maybe he was a little bit marginalized because his coverage in the newspaper kind of was less frequent. But he died in honor in 1988, never really suffered. So compare with other figures, and you considering his experience in America about 9 decades, about 1 decade, 9 years, closely with everybody, and associated with everybody, and he didn't suffer. His techniques were, but he didn't suffer. He survived. Okay, yeah.
Other questions? I want to thank Professor Gao for an excellent talk.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.